The Isle of Man Electoral Commission recently published its report, which makes recommendations to Tynwald in relation to House of Keys constituency boundaries. The report is due to be debated in March, so do Commission members Sally Bolton and Nigel Davis expect trouble in the debate?
Well, from the feedback we've had, there are certain members, I think, that have publicly stated that they're not in favour of it. However, I think that when the first report, which, as you'll probably remember, was the process was done between 2011 and 2013, that wasn't smooth either. But I think Tynwald did agree that the principles were more important to apply than the individual effects. So hopefully the same attitude will prevail, and that Tynwald will accept and agree with us that the principles should be upheld, the principles that we identified at the first boundary review committee, which was mainly the principles of equality and equivalency, so that the voting power of every individual on the island was roughly equal and equivalent to each other.
And Nigel, I mean, your remit, it's quite specific, isn't it?
Well, there's two parts to the remit that we had. One was about the number and boundaries of the constituencies, number of seats per constituencies. Those were the key reporting subjects. But we also had a second part, which is more general, but including accessibility, which we think is extremely important, which I think we'll talk about in more detail. Different types of voting, which already exist, postal and proxy voting procedures, the ability to vote at any polling station across the constituency, and the feasibility of setting up a central regional polling stations that anyone from across the island could vote on. Organisation of pre-election meetings, as well as candidate campaign material. So core reporting about boundaries and size, but also a plethora of other topics around the processes of elections.
And so much now is done online. One of your recommendations suggests that perhaps we could look a little bit closer at the potential for voting online.
Yes, that was an area that actually Nigel was looking at specifically. He's got quite a much more technical background than I have. But what we discovered was, while it would be lovely, and as a deputy returning officer, I would agree, it would be great if you could do everything from your phone online, and not even have to bother to go into a polling station. But unfortunately, from our assessments around the world, it's much more complicated than that. And the most important part is to enable the population to have trust and in the integrity of the systems. And to this end, we've looked at different parts which we see as maybe building blocks, which might make it a bit easier to administer and deal with the day-to-day parts of the election, which the public and the candidates probably don't really see, such as the operation of the postal voting system, that sort of thing. So, as I say, Nigel did a lot of research. Perhaps your listeners might be interested in hearing some of that.
Certainly. I mean, Nigel, presumably the whole trust thing, is this a generational thing whereby people who have been brought up using doing everything online trust the system, whereas the older generation are much more cautious?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, obviously, online voting certainly is under the kind of remit of accessibility, or subject of accessibility. As we know from the previous general election in 2021, youth turnout was at around 46%, which is lower than the total turnout. So there is an opportunity to attract certain groups of people who are less inclined to vote through online voting. And obviously, as Sally mentioned, if you can vote from your sofa at home, it makes it much easier for people to do that. There are a lot of benefits for online voting. It can widen participation. Time poor people can vote from home, as I said, and we can get bigger engagement in the process from certain groups of people. But there are lots of benefits, but there are also concerns, and that's what came out in our work as a commission. One is security. Obviously, people are concerned about, can someone influence from outside the result of an election, for one. Then there's trust in the system, as Sally said. There's an example from Netherlands from 2007, and they were using e-voting machines placed in polling stations. So it's a bit different from online voting. And as a result of two parliamentary committees investigating this, which heavily criticised the management of the e-voting technology, they abandoned it entirely and went straight back to paper voting. So there is a real importance around security and transparency, gaining acceptance of all stakeholders, not just the voters, but also the candidates, to believe that this is actually going to get a true and fair result. And there should be some sort of accreditation process, audit process that can be published so people can make an informed decision whether this platform can deliver a free and fair election.
And in terms of the potential success of online voting, is there any place in the world which is using it now successfully?
A lot of countries are using online voting to varying degrees. For instance, in France, military personnel who are abroad during the time of the general election can vote online. Some states in Australia allow certain groups of people to vote online. So it is used, but there's only one example there where it is used for parliamentary elections, and that's Estonia. They have built almost their entire interaction between the public and Parliament as an online process. Voting is just another part of that online interaction with government. They started parliamentary elections online voting in 2007 for the first time. At that election, only 5.5% of the votes cast actually went through online process. In 2019, the last general election they had, over 43% of all votes cast went through online. So they've been remarkably successful. But I have to stress that in order to duplicate a system like that anywhere, including the island, we would have to have a digital ID card, identification card, which is something that this island is not planning, as far as we know, to introduce. So their system, while it works, it cannot be just copy and pasted into the island environment.
One of the first two of your recommendations talk about constituency size, and then the thorny recommendation, the one which is most likely to result in some members at least raising concerns, is in relation to changes to two, it'll be four constituencies, one that will need to be changed. Why have you picked on this 15%? Presumably it's a 15% plus or minus constituency size. Why is that figure used?
15% is the absolute maximum guideline international standard. That the purpose of 15% enables us to have sufficient flexibility to enable community boundaries to be taken into account, because the Isle of Man is relatively small. In the UK, it's only 5%. So if a population goes over or under 5%, then the Electoral Commission in the UK apparently will just move the boundary, and it doesn't have to go to Parliament, as far as I understand, and it will just be changed. We are mindful of the effect on communities, and we didn't want to make we wanted to make as few changes as was possible to ensure that there is stability, because one of the things that has been said to us is that, well, I didn't know that I'd moved constituency, etc. So if we were moving them backwards and forwards all the time, then I think we'd get more complaints. But really, what we wanted to do was to have to take into account the communities, but we have to use the maximum standard set by international commissions as being the most that we can do. So there were two constituencies, Ramsey and basically Glenfaber and Peel, that were over the 115%, and next to them are constituencies which were quite significantly under the average, which is obviously 100%. So it became necessary that we would need to move those boundaries to take into account the changes in the population that had occurred. So this is going to happen, whenever there are changes, and we took advice from the planning policy unit as well as to where there were likely to be changes. And I think really it's a factor that is going to come up probably by the next boundary review, certainly by the next boundary review. And one of our, I don't think it's down as a recommendation, but our suggestions is that that the governor in council who appoints the Electoral Commission might consider, if there have been changes between now and after the next election, 2026, that possibly another Electoral Commission could be appointed to look into this. And as long as the principles of equality and equivalency apply, again, it could be that our members of Tynwald might say, well, yes, 12-2s was fine as an interim stage, but now perhaps we should be looking at a different combination. When we took evidence this time, just about everybody said, well, not everybody, but most people said that the 12-2 system worked for them. Most of the MHKs did. It may be that larger constituencies with more members in might be a suitable compromise that might take into account rural and town. And I don't think these are beyond the wit of us as or of our politicians to devise a system that is fair across the board, taking into account the interests of both the country and the town, which inevitably, if you had bigger constituencies, bigger sized constituencies, would occur. So I think it could be that Tynwald next time, whenever it does appoint another electoral commission, might want to direct the commission to consider whether a larger constituency size would be better, with more MHKs, and you could possibly have, say, 2 MHKs dealing with constituency matters and 2 dealing with more international policy matters, as it must be very difficult for an MHK, particularly if they're a minister, to be able to deal with their constituency matters at the same time. So I think the way we see it is that this is a direction of travel. We are in an evolving process, and I would say that we're very proud and privileged to have been able to put forward some suggestions that may assist in that evolving process. I don't think we'll ever get it completely right, but I think we are certainly both looking at the principles of fairness, of equality, equivalency, and particularly in this report, we're looking at the principle relating to accessibility and encouraging people to take up their privilege of being able to vote on the island.
And Nigel, I mean, should MHKs be deciding what their constituencies should look like, or should this be really a step taken outside of the whole political debate?
Well, that's not a topic that the Electoral Commission has actually been tasked to look at. If you wanted to be absolutely free and fair, I guess they shouldn't be deciding on where these boundaries or how many their constituencies are. But the way it is set up at the moment, that is, they're going to be voting on this.
Because the same sort of applies in relation to the returning officer. So the returning officer of the Isle of Man is the chief secretary, or whatever the chief secretary is now called. Is it chief operating officer or chief executive? And that is effectively someone who is working very closely with a small team of the Keys, which is effectively Council of Ministers. And then come election time, he has to be completely neutral, forget about the relationships that he's developed over the preceding 5 years, and then conduct a free and fair election.
Well, he does effectively delegate the operation to the deputy returning officers. I do see that there needs to be separation of powers, and I think that the appointment of an independent electoral commission is an important part of that. We, of course, took evidence from any MHK or MLC who wished to give us evidence, and we had basically a framework of questions that we went through with them to find out what the points were that. So they raised particular points that had happened to them in the election or points they wanted to make, but also they followed the questions that we were asking, we wanted to get evidence about. So at the moment, I would say, well, certainly we are a very independent commission. We have had the benefit of using some of the staff of the Cabinet Office, which has been very welcome, and I'd have to give a shout out to them. Thank you very much to Frank and his team, because they've been able to direct us to information that we've looked at, and we've obviously done our own research. But it's a very interesting and evolving area, the nature of democracy, and democracy is under threat all over the world at the moment. So I feel proud that we're able to stand up for it in the Isle of Man.
One of the recommendations is for the Clerk of Tynwald's office to promote electoral awareness. Now, I wonder whether you could explain a little bit more what you mean by that.
Well, turnout is on decline, is in decline, and I think turnout in 2016 was around 52%. And we're about 2 percentage points down. We're around about 50, just over 50% now. This is not unusual. This is happening. This is a trend that's happening across the world where elections are taking place. So we wanted to understand, is there something that we could recommend that would hopefully reverse that trend? So we spoke to the Department of Education, Sport and Culture to see what they're doing. They're very active in primary and secondary schools. Assemblies about the Manx political system, electoral process, and that stuff. Also, we spoke to the Clerk of Tynwald's office, whose ultimate responsibility is to promote the awareness of the history and of the island and the Manx political system, and they are also being very active. The question is, will that translate into something in bigger turnout into 2026? We'll have to find out. But we did identify, having spoken to them and others, that there is an opportunity around new residents, people are arriving on the island, and the makeup of the island has changed considerably since 2016. Today, 10% of the island is not born on the Isle of Man or in the UK or an island, so they're from outside. I mean, the proximity of the island, therefore have come, no doubt, from different political systems, different electoral processes, and they don't necessarily understand their right to vote or how to vote. There are no political parties here. Many are independent candidates. What does that mean? How do people make decisions without a political manifesto? These people, and there's people who don't speak the language, or they speak it as a second language. We visited Cafe Lingo, and out of 10 people who understood they had a right to vote, only 2 out of those 10 actually registered. Okay, so there is an opportunity to bring this community, this newcomers community, into the political process and get enfranchised. So one of our recommendations, I believe it's a recommendation or a suggestion at least, that we invest more money or find a resource to invest in educating, carry on educating children and others, but also new residents and people with a UK English as a second language into franchisement.
Yeah, and of course, it's not just people from further afield. Even if you came from the UK, where you have political parties, very defined political parties and very divergent views, you don't find that on the Isle of Man as a body. We do have political parties, but they don't necessarily follow what the UK political parties mean. And so anybody coming to the island I would challenge anybody to come here and understand immediately what the political system is. And for that reason, I think it's not surprising that the turnout from perhaps newer residents is likely to be lower. And so we want to include as many people as possible. So we're encouraging people to register to vote, and that's a relatively straightforward technological development, so people can register to vote online, and they can also register. They can also apply online for, or we're able to devise an online application for postal voting. So those things, I'm hoping, or we are hoping, will make it more accessible to people who are not familiar with our particular unique type of system.
And of course we also have local authority elections. Presumably your commission doesn't go as far as looking at that.
No. We've kept out of local authority elections. That's a bit of a more thorny subject, but I dare say, that some of the principles should apply across the board. We haven't looked specifically at local authorities, but it could be that a future commission might consider how the principles could apply to local authorities and representation within local authorities. So, really, if we can set out principles and guidelines that can make the whole system better, that's what we want to do.
Well, we've almost reached the end of the programme, believe it or not. Are you reasonably confident that Tynwald is just going to look at your report and say, these are excellent recommendations and yes, of course we'll support them? Or do you think there may be some challenge?
Well, it's been reported in the press that there's going to be challenge. Tynwald needs to be mindful of its reputation on the international stage, and the principles that are already set down. We have 2 meetings with members to explain our position, and they can ask questions. I would hope that they would agree with us that these are sensible and useful recommendations, and are necessary. The changes that we are proposing are necessary for the maintenance of our good standing in the world.
And I suppose then, final word to you, Nigel. I mean, it's hard to argue with meeting international standards when it comes to elections, is it?
I completely agree with what Sally said. I mean, we have a reputation in a free world, democratic world, and we signed up to that in the previous Boundary Review Committee in December of 2011 to these principles, equality and equivalency. These are international standards, and we should keep them in place, in my view.
Should MHKs make decisions about the size of their constituencies? With just under half the voting age population not bothering to vote, should we be looking at much bolder steps in relation to Keys elections?